Jesus.
Welcome back to Sikistan and welcome back to today's video. So today's video is something a little bit different. We haven't done a pay-per-view in probably about 2 months at this stage.
Yeah.
We're going to start doing them again because we've had a nice little break from them and we kind of want to get back on that train. But today's pay-per-view is certainly not a paper. Okay, so one of the things we'll never do, and we made a point of doing this, we'll never rag on other coaches. We'll never rag on other people's programs. You know, a lot of times people have asked us to do things like Joel Seedman, knees over toes, other people's coaches, for example, things like that. And it's something we really don't want to do. We don't want to rag on other people. Just not a good look. It's not something we would enjoy doing. I think it just invites negativity for no reason. However, something we will rag on is poor science and poor scientific methods and poor scientific behaviour, especially in the realms of sports science, which is something we have been and would still involve ourselves in. So recently, some of you may or may have not have seen a post by a page known as WOD Science. They made a post comparing the men and the women from the CrossFit Games event 12 and from the Olympics, from the men's 81 kilo for the snatches and the women's 64 kilo class. So they compared the 10 best from that group and the 10 best from the CrossFitters side of the house. I made a comparison graph and kind of presented in a way such that they were very close from them. They compared it from specialization versus generalization, and they kind of said it in a way that they were offering perspective. Now the issue with perspective, in terms of if we're going by kind of cold hard sciences, essentially there's no such thing as perspective. Perspective is a very subjective point of view. Subjective requires emotion to be involved in things. It requires you to have an understanding of both sides of things, and it is essentially a scalability issue. Whereas when we're looking at, for example, scientific studies, we're looking at things like statistical differences, standard deviations. We're looking at things, do certain p-values, do things have an actual statistical value? There was basically none of that involved in this creation of the graph. The gentlemen who run the page, I think there's two of them, were kind of defending themselves in the comments. They're also phrasing it in such a way that the CrossFitters were very close to the Weightlifters, which I think is, honestly, it's ludicrous. It's a ridiculous statement to make.
They actually said it's pretty amazing to see.
Yes.
CrossFitters only, and they put only in inverted commas, lift 19% less and the women 15% less.
It's honestly, it's insulting to the CrossFitters and it's insulting to the Weightlifters to say something like this. So one of the things is, some of the values they got was the men were only 19.3% difference from the Weightlifters and the CrossFitters, and then the women were only 15% difference between the Weightlifters and the CrossFitters. Now, before we get into this, we never bash CrossFitters. We coach CrossFitters. We have programs for CrossFitters. We literally went over from this event last week on Guy Malheiros' snatch and how amazing that was. So just before we get going, we're not ragging on CrossFit. We're not bashing CrossFit. You guys know we're not doing that. But just a little disclaimer before Dara runs through the perspective of this.
Yeah, so it's important to note that what CrossFitters are doing is they're competing in their own separate sport. And obviously they had a lot of stuff going on before this. What we really want to do here is talk about, firstly, if you run the numbers, how big those differences are when you take them outside of a graph setting. And then Gerf is going to talk about like what a scientific study would look like in this case. First thing we're going to look at is just some brief numbers, right? So we're going to look at that 19% and 15% they talked about on the graph. And what we'll just do is look at our numbers here. So obviously we converted numbers to kilos because we're not psychopaths and we like real numbers that make sense. That gives an average of 130 kilos for the CrossFit group. If we look at the 81 kilo group, it gives an average of 162 kilos, which is a 19% difference. If you take what actual weight a lot of CrossFitters walk around at, you should really include the 96 kilo class as well. And just for the sake of having it here and for the sake of numbers, we will say the 96 kilo class, their average was 171.5 in the snatch. So percentage difference here, right? You have a 19.85% difference between 81 kilo Olympic weightlifters and CrossFit athletes. Then you have a 24.12% difference between weightlifting 96 kilo athletes and CrossFit athletes. What does this look like though? So most of the time, nearly everyone watching this video will have experienced what lifting a barbell is like. You'll probably experience a 10 or a 20% increase from going through a training cycle where you might go from 130 kilos on a back squat to 160 kilos on a back squat. But what we really need to look at is, like, at this elite level, how big are those differences? I think something that's going to be easy for a lot of us to understand is if we look at these differences and translate it to a different sport, what would a 24% difference or a 19% difference look like in a 100-meter sprint? So in a really easy comparison here, right, we look at the 100 meters final from this Olympics. Marcel Jacobs getting a 9.8, I think, at the 100 meters. Obviously, that's not a world record. If we do Usain Bolt's numbers, they'd be significantly different. But for the sake of keeping it all pretty similar here, we'll talk about those numbers. When we look at across the two weight classes, we look at that's equivalent to a 12.25 100 meters or 11.75 100 meters. So take an average of those, or if you just go with the 12.25, how far into the race are the CrossFitter group going to be when the winner finishes? Well, you'll have a CrossFitter after doing 83 meters by the time the winner crosses the line. That is, in the last 2.45 seconds of the 100 meter race, there's still 27 meters or so to go. So you're talking about something longer than the length of a London bus in between these two groups. When you look at all the other groups that finished that 100 meter sprint race, they're all finishing within probably 5 meters of each other, 10 meters possibly if you've a straggler, an outlier, or somebody you pulled up. But you're talking about vast differences. If we were to play a video on the screen now of a 100 meter sprint, wait for everybody to finish the race and then count 1, 2, at 2.25. It's an absolutely massive difference. If you look at what high school boys will do, so we looked just for a race that was on YouTube for some example here. So this is a under 13 boys 100 meter final. This is the consolation race, and you have the winner winning the race in 12.5 seconds. So it's not anything to do with these runners. It's nothing to do with CrossFitters' ability to sprint. But if people oftentimes get mixed up because weightlifting is so objective, we just see a number, it becomes really, really simple to say like, oh, my number is 40 kilos more than you. It took me 3 years to get the last 40 kilos, so it's going to get me 3 years to get the next 40. It is so vastly beyond the realms of possibility that any of these would be certainly not amazing or interesting to see how close it was. It's really not close at all.
So, like Fitz said there, the idea that each kilo would be represented by the same amount of work and the same ability to increase by each one of those kilos. The same amount of work will get you that next kilo, which is just not true. Some of those kilos for the vast majority of people in the world would just be unattainable. No matter how much work or how much improvement they would have made to try and get better, they simply would not increase by those percentages. Some of those percentages points are literally just impassable for a certain percentage of the population, and very, very likely a lot of these CrossFitters doing this event, while very, very talented, would simply be unable to be beyond certain values. Like some of them might not be able to get on a 150 kilo snatch, and the possibility of them even snatching 160 kilos would be absolutely incredible. You know, even if one or two of them, for Guy is probably the most likely person who would probably snatch 160, he is still 17 kilos off that person who won Miso Asana, who won the 2020 Olympics or 2021 Olympics this year. So it's an enormous difference. It's literally hard to even put into kind of words how much of a difference that is. It's nearly indescribable how much work, time and dedication and ability and genetics that would take to get to those numbers. So it's just saying only 20% is honestly, and I just can't say it enough, is ludicrous. So if we were to, for example though, let's look at this like we were actually going to do this through a kind of a rigorous scientific study and approach this in a method by where we would actually see, could we actually find what kind of difference there is, and is there like a meaningful difference between CrossFitters and weightlifters' best Olympic lifts? So what would we do is we'd go to myself and Fitz would be the two researchers on the panel. We get ethics approval, and then we would say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put forward a hypothesis. We are going to put ourselves in a position where we can get access to a certain number of CrossFitters and a certain number of weightlifters. We do a power analysis, and we would learn, say, for example, let's say we needed 24 elite weightlifters and, for example, 24 elite CrossFitters or something like that. And we needed those number of athletes to give us a meaningful result in our statistical analysis. So what we do is we'd set up a null hypothesis. We would say, is there a meaningful difference between CrossFitters and weightlifters? Olympic lifting ability, and then we would do a testing event. So we would get our CrossFitters in and our weightlifters in, all in the same gym on the same day. We would get a familiarization day, so they'd get used to using that equipment and that platform at that same time of day after the same kind of warm-up. Everyone would do the exact same warm-up, everyone had the same number of attempts, everyone would be under the same amount of drug testing, everyone would use the same equipment, everyone would have to take the same attempts and the same jumps warming up until we got to a 1RM, for example. We'd need to keep levels of stimulation, levels of light in the room, levels of music, for example, people's training blocks the same. And then we would need to repeat this maybe more than once, for example. Then we would put ourselves in a scenario, we get these results, we would look at these, we would do different forms of statistical analysis, and then we would get a results, and we'd probably get something like a p-value. Now, the p-value standard everyone agrees to use is 0.05, and if it's less than this, we agree that the results are statistically significant or insignificant, depending on where your null hypothesis is. But the problem with this, even in sports science, and it's something that's discussed a lot in the papers we've reviewed, is that using that p-value of 0.05 is literally just an arbitrary value that everyone in statistics essentially has agreed to use. You could use any value you wanted to describe something as statistically significant. Now, the problem with this is it doesn't really represent what each kilo of increase in weightlifting really means. So while on numbers it might look quite close, even though it doesn't really. I think everyone would agree plus 20% is an enormous difference in basically anything. For example, if you were to do this in if creatine gave you a 20% increase in performance, you'd be like, that's a fucking enormous, that's an order of magnitude more. We literally had Christoph in yesterday, we saw him on Lex Friedman's podcast talking about how performance enhancing drugs only give you a 10% increase in performance. So the fact that 20% as a value on a page looks enormous, but even in a statistical scenario where we had those numbers, we couldn't really represent what they actually mean if we even did this kind of study.
For me, and definitely it's for Gerf as well, as we've just been discussing this comes down to this kind of misguided opinion that generalization does in some way get us close to results of specialization. It is true that being in good shape, having a very good aerobic base, doing all this general training you might do in a GPP block is really, really beneficial for weightlifters. It's true that having the high training frequencies, the large amounts of kind of physical and psychological resilience you might need as a CrossFitter, all these things add up to making a good weightlifter. But in fact, the specialization of training you need can never ever be pushed past. An interesting kind of anecdote on this is something people talk about in the CrossFit realm a lot is when you get a really good weightlifter like Schmat Schmazer, you might have heard of him, who came in from an Olympic training center. He's been training there full time for 2 years. He retires due to a back injury and now he starts CrossFit. And a number of years into starting CrossFit, he snatches 140 kilos in a gym. And then suddenly the internet explodes. And the internet explodes with, oh my God, that's a new PB for Matt. Oh my God, that's a new PB and he's not even doing weightlifting. Oh my God, that's a new PB and look at how jacked and shredded he is. What you don't realise here is, although the drug testing in weightlifting might be somewhat flippant, the drug testing in CrossFit is non-existent. It's a very simple intelligence test. You might get tested twice a year.
Wait, we should do a video on this.
But it's very likely you might only get tested once a year, and that's if you podium at a serious competition. The other thing you have to take into account is that number lifted in a gym that day might have been the 10th attempt, it might have been the first attempt. But you don't have any restriction like you have a competition, you don't have to weigh in, his weight class could have been significantly different, and also you just have the freedom of being able to wander around the gym, do whatever you want as you go for your attempts. That in no way means CrossFit's the best way of getting weightlifters really strong. If it was, we'd see the Chinese teams, the Eastern European teams, and the successful teams from this Olympics doing bar muscle ups and whatever on a pair of rings. They simply don't do that.
So one thing actually I said if we were in our hypothetical study is if we did drug testing, but actually better for weightlifters if there wasn't drug testing, because then they definitely knew a lot more.
Way more, yeah.
So look, basically, CrossFitters are amazing athletes. You know, we think they are. Weightlifters are phenomenal athletes as well. But this just kind of just ticked us off a little bit when we saw this. So pay-per-views will hopefully be back next week. We'll start doing some things again. A lot of new people since we've done a pay-per-view, so stay tuned if you like those. If people before liked pay-per-views, we'll be doing some more relevant stuff again, finding the newest and interesting pay-per-view stuff. If not, hope you like the video. Please leave a like and comment for the schmalgorithm. Schmanks a lot.
And don't believe everything you see in a graph.
Yeah.